to make a statement like this in the sealing of a marriage vow, I think this is a very significant statement that is being made. And so many times after the wedding, problems start cropping up, and then people start going back and they want to divorce, and many times they're reminded about the vows. I don't know how true the story is, but somebody found a very lame excuse, and they said, well, I didn't say those words, it was the pastor. I was just following after him. I mean, that was a story I've heard, but the point is that these are serious words. I appreciate Dr. Bonya's narrative approach, although I would have been interested to see how he analyzes those. I know he has it in his presentation, those New Testament narratives. My interest in narrative studies really started when I was asked to teach a course on exegesis. And I began to look at various methods of studying the Bible and also delving deep into Scripture. And I also shared and studied, researched a little bit on the method, the narrative method. And I found, especially the Old Testament, that it is rich with these narratives, and we can learn a lot from them. And so I'll be looking at one narrative and also share some insights from Ellen White and James White in terms of their own marriage. We have discovered a few insights into their life over the years, and this is more recent. I think in the 70s, 73, some letters were found that the White estate had to make a decision about, and I'm going to be touching a little bit on those letters and the impact they can have as we look at the lives of these two individuals and how they also struggled with issues within their own marriage. And we're also going to touch a little bit on the health issue. There's a book that BRI has put together on marriage, and I think it is a very sound biblical book that one could recommend as we look at the marriage context. Now, the first case study is dealing with 1 Samuel 25, where we have the story of David with his men. Then we have a family, Nabal and Abigail. Now, looking at the flow of the narrative, we have David and his men in dire need. They were fugitives out in the wild, running away from Saul, who was seeking the life of David. And we see David out in the fields, helping out to protect Nabal's property. His flocks, his shepherds were under the guard and shield of David and his men. They sort of created a strong barrier against the enemies, so that enemies would not attack Nabal's property. Now, following a customary law that whenever there is a practice like this or an occurrence like this, the person who owns the property owes it to these people that have helped him to give a compensation or some kind of help. And so Nabal had come to a point where now he was shearing his sheep, and David noticed that there was no help coming from Nabal's table to assist them with their need. And then David begins to send a delegation to Nabal. Well, the men were given a specific message to deliver. And now we have an insight into this family as Nabal responds in a demeaning and unacceptable way to David. And then David plans an attack on Nabal's household, so the conflict begins in a sense. Now I want us to look at the way the whole narrative is structured. Students of the passage consider it as relatively self-contained and a unified account. And the story begins and is completed in this chapter, and lessons can somehow be drawn from the narrative, especially after one has done a detailed study. Now, looking at Nabal's character and lifestyle versus Abigail's is very revealing and interesting. Nabal displays an autocratic arrogance. In verse 3, he is described as hard and evil. And in verse 17, his servants, his own people, refer to him as a son of worthlessness. And then in verse 36, we discover that he is drunk. He had a party and he is drunk. And then in verse 37, he dies of a stroke. So just looking at this man's life, just in this short story, there's a lot that is uncovered about his character and his lifestyle. On the other hand, we look at Abigail. She's described in just the opposite terms. She has good understanding, she is beautiful, and she is very sober in her approach to the problem. And so as we look at this family unit and looking at the issues that they are facing, it is important for us to consider and look at what lessons we can learn out of this narrative, and especially as we think about a healthy family, because we see here some signs of dysfunctionality in the way this family is operating. There are a number of issues that, or at least indicators of this kind of dysfunctionality in this family. So as we explore this, I'd like us to look at the qualities that Ellen White ascribes to Abigail. I'm going to just summarize these without really reading every line. She is wise and she loves God. She is devoted. She is humble, self-sacrificing. She has wisdom from above. I've just highlighted a few key points from these passages that, and Ellen White further tries to apply this, especially in a family setting. She talks about words of calm, well-directed wisdom, Abigail was wise and a reprover and a counselor. Power of her influence and reasoning, and she advised her husband, or David rather, righteously. When he was about to attack, she meets him and reverses the whole process of what he wanted to do. Now, because of our time, I'm going to skip some of the sections and maybe just highlight the importance of the group dynamics as we look at marriage in context. And thinking about this, especially within the African context, the family unit is never just a question of individuals. It is a unit that even has extended members. So you have a family unit that has various strata, and at each level you'd find a very important and interesting way in which the family operates and moves. Some of the challenges that we face as we look at this family structure, especially in the context of Africa, is that many times the family unit, which is mother, father, children, may have accepted the Adventist faith, and then beyond that you would have the extended family. Now, the extended family may not be Seventh-day Adventists, and they are rooted in the traditional beliefs and traditional practices, rituals, and so on. And when it comes to matters of illness, sickness, and so on, they have a different approach to dealing with these things. And so as we look at how these family matters are handled, I remember in a pastoral district where I had a situation where this man suffered a stroke. And during the time as we ministered to the family, the wife seemed to have accepted the situation, and she was very supportive to her husband, and they were moving along together. But then the extended family were concerned that nothing like this has ever happened in this family. And therefore, we cannot leave this matter as it is. Something has to be done. And so the extended family were not Adventists. And so they were saying, there are other solutions. We've given you enough time to deal with this thing. And it seems all your prayers are not going anywhere. And so it's time for us to also have a share in helping you to deal with this. We believe there is a solution. I think Dr. Khabasian dealt with some of the issues in his presentation, which I appreciated very much. And so they began to really put pressure on the family. There was an elderly Adventist man who tried to stand, up against this, but it was not helping. And they really wanted to take up their sticks, as we would say it, and go to the witch doctors and to get, according to their view, another perspective to this illness. And it became a very, very serious tension now on the family, because now the members of the family were also divided within the Adventist sort of members. Some were saying, let's allow them to do whatever they want to do. It's not going to change our beliefs. Let them do whatever they want to do. On the other hand, other family members were saying, no, allowing them to do whatever they want to do with somebody that has grounded his life and in faith in God, because now he can't make a decision himself, it's unfair to subject him to this kind of experience. And so, the tensions continued, and finally, I believe they did give in, and they went to these diviners. The family actually took him, and they took him away from his wife, and they were attempting all kinds of approaches in order to bring healing in that situation, but it never changed anything. So he came back later on. These are some of the challenges that families are facing. And so as we look at the whole group dynamics, I have a section where I deal with that, but unfortunately our time is really gone. I'm going to go into the analysis of, or the discussion on Ellen White's marriage now, just to share some insights there of what I have found, and then we can wind it up. Okay, looking at Ellen and James White's experience as case number 2. In 1973, a collection of about 2,000 letters were found that were addressed to Lucinda Hall from some pioneers, including Ellen and James White. The story of how these letters came to the White estate may be found in Review and Herald of August 16, 1973. There was a very close relationship between Ellen White and Lucinda Hall. Lucinda had worked as Ellen White's literary assistant and had developed a very close relationship with the family. She was born in 1839 and died in 1929. And Ellen White wrote 4 letters to Lucinda in which she poured her heart about a very personal family issue or family issues. So in the 4th letter, she urged her to destroy all the letters that dealt with this particular issue. And obviously she did not, and that's why we have them. These letters provide additional insight into that personal relationship, especially it was about the relationship at that time between Ellen White and James. You can find this article by Tim Poyer, our vice director at the White Estate, in the encyclopedia, or Ellen White Encyclopedia 394, where you get the elaborate story about this. So as we look at James and Ellen White, they got married in 1846, August 30. Their relationship was deeply rooted in mission. And in fact, if you look back at the way they got married, it was more the fact that they were doing mission work together, and whenever they were planning and working, they would be worried that they are just on their own. And so sometimes they would arrange somebody to be around so that they avoid the appearance of evil. So they were very conscientious about the appropriate way of relating at that point. And so they decided, well, we've worked so well together, and there's this pressure now that we can't work together unless somebody is around to make sure that we are not appearing to be on the side of intimate relationships. So they decided it's better, let's get married. And that was, the main sort of motivation. Their main focus was on the mission. And they were both co-founders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, as we know, very gifted leaders, and their marriage was not trouble-free, as we will look very briefly at this particular situation. Now, James White suffered multiple strokes around the late 1870s, because he died in 1881. So a few years before that, he suffered a number of strokes. And at this time, their marriage was severely strained and very much under test. And it's quite interesting how Ellen White expresses herself as she experiences this change in James White's experience and life. In letter 64 of 1876, she says, "I can but dread the liability of James's changeable moods." So her frustration was that James had seemed to have changed so much, and she could not understand. And today, I think medical science has discovered a number of things, emotional changes that occur when a person suffers a stroke, which were not known back in the time. And so they were experiencing this and going through this challenge, but they could not understand what was going on between them. And she says, as she reflects, "I have not lost my love for my husband, but I cannot explain things." And she's writing to Lucy Hall and pouring her heart to her about this challenge that she's facing. She can't understand the changes in her husband's behavior and way of doing things, and she still loves him, but she can't explain all these things that are happening. And you can further read this in Daughters of God, which was finally published. All these letters were finally published in Daughters of God, page 263, for more details there. So Ellen White had, a number of counsels that were very positive about marriage, and her marriage was also an exemplary marriage, and this is a window within their time of marriage that was a very challenging one for them. She says in Life Sketches 125, 126, "Marriage marks an important era in the lives of men. Whoever findeth a wife findeth a good thing and obtaineth favor in the Lord." We were married on August 30, 1846, and from that hour unto the present, he has been the crown of my rejoicing. I think I made an error there when I typed this. So one has to find here an expression of deep love that they have for each other, in spite of the challenges that they were facing. Now let's look at a summary. Ellen White and James White faced a very difficult time in their life, but there are certain things that kept their marriage together, their marriage healthy, and their marriage whole, in spite of this very challenging time of their experience. Number one, it was teamwork. During this time, of the challenge, Ellen White had begun to actually work independently, alone, and she had a reason for that, and her reason was that James would be more controlling at times, and he would want to know exactly who is going to be at the meeting. He was ill, but he was concerned about him not being able to accompany her to these meetings, and afraid that the brethren may want to control Ellen White in terms of influencing her. And he wanted to sort of take charge and be there. But Ellen White felt that he needed to stay and look after his health and so on. So this tension began building up. So during that short time, they communicated still. Ellen White would report almost to the last detail of everything that is happening, and sometimes even ask for permission from James to do certain things during this. So the teamwork kept their marriage together, and I think their focus also was more on the mission. And then mutual interest in nurturing the marriage through mutual respect, affection, and admiration. And their focus was on the big picture. And then we see mutual complementation in their experience. So when one looks at this, there's a whole article. I'll show you the source as we wind up. So there's a very close tie that kept them together. And when one looks at all these key points that summarize the life of Ellen and James White, especially in that challenging time of illness and difficulties, we find that the healing they had, which was more spiritual and based on a bigger picture of the mission for the church, kept them together. Family group dynamics is rooted in the biblical family structure, can be a source of healing. Abigail was in a dysfunctional marriage with Nabal, but she did not lose her individuality and yet lived communally in terms of a family circle. Ellen and James White experienced the challenging times in their marriage. They focused on the bigger picture as they wrestled with this difficult patch in their marriage experience. Ellen White found someone to confide with and to share her burdens. And so these could be lessons that families could learn as we look at especially challenges in times of illness, and also looking at healing of wounds within a family circle. These are some of the sources that one could look at that were referred to in the whole presentation. Let me stop right there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sokupa. At this point, may we entertain 3 questions or responses by way of comments? Okay, any other?
Thank you. From your presentation, I want to ask if our members asked us at times where there are no more conjugal relations between the husband and wife, and they are still living together, and the man comes and says, there is this problem that we are encountering at home. Or at times, especially in my country, Zimbabwe, we have got many where the man is in Zimbabwe and the wife is in England or South Africa, and he never comes back home. But wherever he is active church member, he is in church programs, but he never comes back home. And the wife also is active church member. And once in a while, some of them come and say, pastors, can you allow me, because of these reasons, to divorce my wife, because it can land me in serious challenges if I continue in this relationship. I don't know what can be our approach to such challenges.
A very relevant and important question. And I think it is a challenge, especially in Africa today, where you'd find people searching for greener pastures and ways of supporting the family. So they would go maybe even overseas to search for means of supporting the family. So these are realities that our families are facing. And so I think it is important for the family, before embarking on a separation of that kind, even though it may just be for economic reasons, to understand that, you know, separation can cause real serious emotional tensions. So I think it will depend on from family to family, their level of maturity and also ways of consideration of each other, because I think that is important. A man may say, no, I really honestly and have no problem, I will meet my family in 1 year, and the woman may not feel that you know, maybe you know, an appropriate decision, but then you know, a compromise may be made to make sure that he visits home. So I think as pastors, I would recommend that it is important for us, whenever we observe those things early in their experience, to have a way of visiting with them, spiritually supporting them, and also counseling with them, especially when they are considering that kind of approach. And I think it has to do with how we also nurture and relate in terms of regular visitations of the family, to understand what in fact they are going through. Otherwise, without those kinds of interventions, and left on its own, it may very well lead to divorce. So I think it is a reality, and sometimes it is based on genuine needs that the family has, and they have sometimes no other options because of the commitments they have, and they are looking for solutions to deal with the problem. I know in South Africa we've had a number of women leaving for the UK to be recruited as nurses, because there's a big need for nurses, and so they would leave the husband with the children. And many times this has been a very challenging experience for the men, and also sometimes for the women as well. So we are in times where this phenomenon is growing, and we do need to find a way of prevention, and also where there are cracks in the family unit, to find a way of bringing healing through counseling, through other means of intervention. That's just my suggestion.
Are there any other questions?
Yes, thank you for the presentation, Doctor. It was very nice. And I just have a question in regards to those letters that you mentioned that were not intended to be seen. Is there not an ethical issue with publishing something that somebody didn't want to be publicized? And that's my question.
Very good question. Yes. The letters were discovered long after Lucinda had died. And she was the one that was given the responsibility to destroy the letters. Now the white estate discovers the letters. So the question is, what do we do? So this discussion, as I read about it, was circling around, and then finally, because of the pressure that the white estate is facing, especially with regards to shielding and keeping away information from people, they decided it may be prudent to share these letters, because one way or another, information leaks and people discover, oh, the white estate is, keeping some letters there that they have found, and they're not sharing those letters. And so it becomes like a conspiracy thing, as if the white estate is hiding things. I think on the strength of that, it was felt that although these were personal letters, there are many other personal letters that are at the white estate that are now open to the reading of the public because of the time lapse, and they could also be a blessing to people that may be facing similar situations, and so on. So.
Our last question.
It was just a follow-up, Dr. Sokupa. The question that Pastor Sibanda asked about what do we do when this kind of separation. So I think most of it you had already taken care of it. But I just wanted to emphasize the fact that as a pastor, we cannot look at the situation and keep quiet. There are situations where you as a leader, as a pastor, you know that this brother is just playing another funny game. We know, you know it very clear. When he speaks, you know this one is trying to play a game. He's trying to play a blame game with his wife whatsoever. I think it is important for us men to challenge our fellow men if it's possible. Say, brother, it is not good for a man to be alone. Just repeat that. It is not right for a man to be alone, and appeal to his heart and keep on talking as you have said, Dr. Sokupa.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sokupa. By way of appreciating the work that is done in the presentation, shall we put our hands together? This marks the end of our session for this morning. Our next